The wars in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, and in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas show no signs of slacking off anytime soon. Many events continue to show that both of those wars in each case could continue to spiral out of control. Neither one of them is running on what anybody might consider a good path. And any of those in the United States that may think that we have a good handle on it are fooling themselves and fooling everyone else, because we don't. And unfortunately, there's plenty of people who do seem to think that we can just control things and just guide things and get them exactly the way we want and have some sort of a good outcome. But that rarely happens in wars. They often take on a path of their own. And as they say, the enemy gets a vote, obviously. But then even within that, just events take on a life of their own that nobody can really control. And it's unclear where things are going to go. But we have somebody great today to help us unravel, or at least give us an insight into where they may be going, despite what anybody may want. And that is Professor John Mearsheimer. John, welcome back to the show. Always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Danny. It's great to be back.
And listen, we're so grateful to have you on, because I know that you're in such high demand. You just were in India taking care of a lot of events over there, and literally around the globe. Everybody is really interested in what you have to say, and for very good reason. But let's jump right into this one here. So let's start off with the Russia-Ukraine war, because there has been what may turn out to be a black swan event, something that shocks the system that no one was expecting. And that is with this terror action that took place on March 27th in Moscow, where 4 gunmen broke into a situation in a concert hall in the outskirts of Moscow, just brutally just mowed down people with automatic weapons and then burned the place to the ground. Just in the most horrific kinds of attacks you can imagine. In some respects, it was similar to part of the Hamas attack into Israel in October of last year, where they attacked an outside concert halls situation. So in some respects, the emotion you can imagine are running very high in Russia, as it was in Israel after that. Now, there was some talk and some concern, and definitely jumped all over the Russian Telegram channels and media spaces, that on 7 March, so about 2 weeks before this attack took place, the United States gave a surprisingly detailed and specific warning, where they said within 48 hours, American citizens should not go anywhere where there's groups in Moscow, especially concert halls. They were very specific about that. It had a very specific time frame. And of course, that's exactly what turned out to happen here. Now, in the immediate aftermath, John Kirby was asked, did the United States know anything about this? And do we think that Ukraine was involved?
There was a State Department issued warning about a potential terrorist activity earlier this month. We don't know right now whether the degree to which that warning and this attack are connected, but there was some concern that we had about the potential for a terrorist attack in and around Moscow earlier this month. So again, we've just got to get more information and try to see if we can put the pieces together. But there was, rightly so, Ben's right, there was a warning to Americans earlier about some concerns of this sort of activity.
Now, first of all, let's just stop there, John. Do you have any information, since all this has happened, as to what the nature of that warning was? Because I'm hearing a bunch of different possibilities, and I'm wondering if you have any clarity on that.
No, I have no clarity. And I actually have not heard anything, unlike you, about what was the basis of that March 7th warning. I've often found it very suspicious, since the attack on the concert, that we gave a warning on March 7th. I don't know whether we gave it to the Russians or not. That's not clear. But we certainly made it public, and the Russians surely picked up on what we said. And you would think that we would now be saying some words about what was the nature of that warning, so that people could make a connection, or try to make a connection between what happened at the concert hall and what was expected to happen via that terrorist warning.
Yeah, now obviously this probably goes without saying, but just in case I want to say it out loud anyway, yeah, one of the first casualties in a war is always the truth. So people are going to say whatever they're going to say to try to justify any number of things, and that means all participants, and nobody's exempted from that. So when I say what some of the Russian media is saying, I'm not giving it any, saying that it's right or it's wrong or anything else. but I'm telling you what they're reporting. And it's important to point out because this is in large measure what Russians are believing. And we're going to hear from Russian President Vladimir Putin in a minute where he's echoing some of these things. But some of the beliefs are on the Russian side that there was going to be an attack on the Crocus Hall somewhere between 8 and 9 March, and it turned out that there was a venue there. There was a artist that was very closely connected with Vladimir Putin, was a big advocate of his, and so because of that risk, apparently Russia did take some action and put a lot more security around the venue to make sure that nothing happened, and nothing did happen. There is also some reports that at least one of the 4 assailants who would later attack was seen on a camera on the premises on the 8th of March. So it implies that maybe that was going to be the case. But then the extra security took it out. So then once the security left and they went back to their normal posture, that's when they ended up striking that venue anyway. And the worry was that the U.S. apparently, according to their view, suspected that the Ukraine was going to do something, and we did not want them to do that. Apparently, we've been telling them, and this is before the 22nd of March, even an open source, that the U.S. has been saying, hey, all these attacks into Belgorod and against civilian targets in there, that's not helping. It's not helping anything. Stop doing it. And allegedly, somebody in the U.S. got wind that Ukraine was planning to do something like this through ISIS, through intermediaries in ISIS, and that they wanted to try and preempt it by allowing Russia to know some of the information. Whether that's true, I have no idea, but that's certainly circulating throughout the world in Moscow.
I've heard the story, and it sounds plausible that the actual attack was aimed at March 8th, and it didn't happen for the reasons that you described, and of course it happened later. But it's not clear to me, Danny, that we expected that particular attack on March 8th, and that's what we warned the Russians about. You would think if we had anticipated an attack at that particular concert hall, and the Russians knew that they would have increased the security there. And there's no evidence that they did. So I'm not sure that we anticipated that attack on March 8th. It may be that we just had a more general fear that a terrorist attack was coming. But it's just so hard to tell based on the limited information that we have at this juncture.
Certainly it is. So that was on March 22nd. On the next day, on March 23rd, and of course, anytime something like this happens, all eyes immediately in Russia go to Kiev. Definitely they were behind it, no matter what. Even if it turned out 100% to actually be ISIS, everybody assumes that it was Ukraine. For a number of reasons, not just because they're at war, but for some other specific reasons, which Putin talked about, I think, just yesterday, today, actually, or their time today. We'll get to that in a second. But Zelensky, but boy, he was quick and adamant that he had nothing to do with it.
What happened yesterday in Moscow is obvious. Both Putin and other scoundrels simply try to blame everything on someone else. They always resort to the same methods. It's been done before. Yesterday, all this happened, and this absolute miserable Putin, instead of attending to his own citizens of Russia, addressing them, remained silent for a day, thinking about how to link this with Ukraine. Everything is absolutely predictable. Those hundreds of thousands of Russians who are now killing on Ukrainian land would surely be enough to stop any terrorists. And if the Russians are ready to silently die in Crocus halls and not ask any questions to their security and intelligence agencies, then Putin will try to turn such a situation to his personal advantage again.
Now, White House spokesperson KJP also heard all these rumors about that it was Ukraine connected with it, and even though it looked like it was ISIS, maybe there's some conviction, but she made no doubt where the U.S. government stands.
ISIS bears the sole responsibility here. The sole responsibility, and Mr. Putin understands that. We shared that with their government, and so there is no evidence, absolutely no evidence that Ukraine was involved here.
Now, of course, the answer to that last part depends on where you sit, but what are your thoughts generally on what happened here, and importantly enough, what's going to happen next, do you think?
Well, just getting back to this young woman's comments, how does she know? I mean, how can you make a statement like this? The whole thing is just rather bizarre. The Russians have these four individuals now, and they're going to interrogate them. And with the passage of time, we're going to find out lots of facts, but we just don't have many facts now. And that includes her, and that includes the US government. So I just am amazed that people make those statements. Putting her comments aside, the United States government, within an hour after the terrorist attack, said that Ukraine had nothing to do with it, and this was solely an ISIS endeavor. And again, you say to yourself, how did we know that? It's really quite remarkable what's going on here. And of course, as you pointed out, what the Russians are trying to do is either say or hint that the Ukrainians are behind this. And what the Ukrainians are trying to say is they had absolutely nothing to do with this. And the Americans, of course, are parroting what the Ukrainians say. But where the truth lies remains to be determined.
It does, but it's important just to point out, again, not making any assessment of what's accurate or not, but what the Russians are saying. And here is Putin, I think, in the on the 24th, I think is this one, where he's saying, hey, we recognize that there was Islamists behind it, but
that this crime was committed by radical Islamists, people who are combated around the world. We see that the United States are using their channels to whitewash their satellites and all of those who, according to their statements, have no part in this terrorist attack. And they're saying that it is the banned organization of ISIS is fully responsible, but we know who carried out the attack. We are interested in knowing who ordered this attack.
And then a little bit later in that same speech that he was given there on national television, he said, here's one of the reasons why we don't believe it was just ISIS, because of it fits a pattern, what he claims Ukraine has been doing prior to this date.
This has led to their attempts to penetrate our borders and their shellings of Russian civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, their attempts to make strikes at the Crimean Bridge, the Crimean Peninsula. These steps make up a logical sequence of terrorist attacks and attempts to intimidate the Russian society and sow discord, and at the same time to show their own population that the Kiev regime is still strong, that the only thing people need is to obey the orders that come from Washington, fight to the last Ukrainian.
So what do you make of some of the substance there, some of his claims that these attacks on Belgorod, some of the others, like the Kerch Bridge, the civilian bridge, what he claims there, the Donetsk cities, a lot of shells have been going really throughout the entire war into the civilian part of Donetsk city, down on the front line of contact. Do those qualify as legitimate military targets, or does it just matter on if you think it's a military target, yes for Ukraine, no for Russia?
Whether they're legitimate military targets is a different issue than the question of whether this attack fits the general pattern that we've seen over the past year or so. And therefore, that's solid evidence that the Ukrainians are behind this attack on the concert. And I just don't think you can make that argument. It may fit the general pattern, but in the final analysis, that doesn't tell you much. We just need much more hard evidence about where these four guys were getting their direction, where they were getting paid, what exactly was going on. A number of people have pointed out they were heading towards the Ukrainian border, and there's some evidence that they had contacts there who would help them into Ukraine. One would think if that's true, that tells you a great deal, and that the Russians, in interrogating these people, will find out a lot about what their connections were with Ukraine. But until that happens, it's just impossible to say, in my opinion, whether this is linked to Ukraine in any meaningful way.
And there's, speaking of that, there was just a few hours ago on Russian media, RIA Novosti, there was a statement by one of the senior officials of the government that said that they've been doing some continued interrogations of these people, and they're actually, according to him, there is starting to become more and more evidence of a Ukrainian connection. Here's what they said. Gary, if you can throw that up on the screen there from RIA Novosti. He said that they confirm, so they say, Ukrainian trace. And then when you read down further into the article, you see it says this is the FSB director, Bortnikov. The primary data that we receive from the detainees confirms this. Therefore, we will continue to refine the information that should show us whether the presence and participations of the Ukrainian side is real or not. Almost sounded like you do. They're going to continue to investigate. But in any case, he adds, so far, there are grounds to say that this is exactly the case. Now, whether there actually is or not, I mean, there's certainly going to be the danger that Putin is going to use this opportunity to justify some potential expansion of the war and then use it as, say, we found out now there's undeniable evidence that Ukraine did it, and they'll fill in the blank, whatever that is. Do you see any potential, or do you see any gain even for Russia to escalate beyond what they've been doing in Ukraine right now militarily?
Well, in terms of influencing the outcome of the war, I don't think that they need this incident to justify further escalation, which they're otherwise reluctant to take for fear that, it would get them in trouble with world opinion or something like that. I mean, I think they're doing quite well on the battlefield. They're doing everything they want to do, and they don't need this event to justify further military actions against the Ukrainian army. I think, however, if there's hard evidence that the Ukrainians are behind this, it's going to lead to significant escalation. I think the Russians are going to have to retaliate in a serious way. Exactly what they do, I don't know. But I don't think that will have that much effect on events on the battlefield.
And do you have any, just ideas of what a range of possibilities, what could Russia do if they want to retaliate? Because it seems to me that the pressure on Putin from the domestic audience is going to be similar to what it was in Israel after October 7th and in the United States after 9/11, that he can't just do nothing. He can't maybe lob a few missiles into, who knows, Tajikistan or Afghanistan, where ISIS-K is headquartered. It doesn't seem like that would satisfy people. But what could he do? What do you think are some of the things that you're concerned about?
Well, the targets would have to be in Ukraine. Those are the key targets that we care about, because we're hypothesizing a situation here where there's clear evidence that Ukraine was involved. And I think at this point in time, he would have to go after civilian targets. I mean, despite all the rhetoric in the West and in Ukraine about the fact that Russia is killing massive numbers of civilians and waging a wicked punishment campaign similar to what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, that is simply not the case. It's actually quite remarkable to me the extent to which the Russians have gone not to attack civilian targets. But one could argue that what they will do in response is that they will go after certain civilian targets. They will go after, intelligence headquarters and other command centers around Ukraine. But I think also one could make an argument that Putin is too smart a character to really unleash the dogs full force, to really wage a wicked punishment campaign against the civilian population in Ukraine. I think ultimately that would not be a smart policy. I think that he should be much more selective in his response, not follow in the footsteps of the Israelis or not follow in the footsteps
George Bush,
of the Americans after 9/11.
Yeah. Yeah, that would almost be an embarrassment to us if he does remain measured and restrained and calculating in what he does, because we don't seem to be able to do that. Certainly, obviously, with the 2003 war, we launched into to Iraq on the claims of the connection to 9/11, but we'll touch on that one later on, maybe. Let me ask you on the terms of the general conduct of the war, because whatever he may or may not do here has to fit in with what his larger campaign plan is. And as I think we discussed the last time you were on here, things are definitely trending in the way of Russia right now, especially in terms of ammunition, both for Russia and for Ukraine in terms of how little is coming and how much is coming. We've seen some recent information out in the last couple of days that knew that more of these glide bombs are coming off in now larger quantities and larger diameters, weight classifications, which can cause a lot of damage on there. And Russia continues to recruit more people that Ukraine can never match, and they're forced mobilizations, which are not working at all, according to most reports that I have. So the general arc of the war is already moving in Russia's favor. And so do you see any change to that? And might this fit in, or how might this fit into that arc?
Well, to get back to the previous point and related to the question you just asked, I think from the Russian point of view, what you want to do is focus on winning the war and not getting sidetracked. And therefore, I think that what happens on the battlefield should be Putin's primary concern. And there, I think he is, as I've said on a number of occasions, in the catbird seat. As you described it, the balance of weaponry on the two sides is shifting in favor of the Russians. And there's no evidence that the West has the ability to redress that balance. Furthermore, as you pointed out, when you look at what's happening in terms of air power, in terms of these glide bombs, it's quite clear that this is a huge force multiplier for the Russian forces, that they're using these formerly dumb bombs, now smart bombs, to great effect, not only on the front lines, but deep inside of Ukraine. So the balance of firepower here in terms of artillery plus air power is shifting in the Russians' favor. And then there's the critical element of manpower. And there, the Ukrainians are really in deep trouble. The Russians have done a first-rate job mobilizing troops, training them, and preparing them for battle. Whereas the Ukrainians have not only lost many more troops than the Russians have, but the Ukrainians are not able to put in place a mobilization plan. Forget the question of whether that mobilization plan is effective or not. The legislation is stale.
It's hard to believe how that's going on. Yeah, it's been dragging on for months just to get the legislation done.
Yes, exactly. They can't seem to agree. And actually, when you look carefully at the manpower situation, from a Ukrainian point of view, it's actually quite depressing. There are huge numbers of people, young males, who could otherwise serve in the military, who are outside of the country. And if you look at the males inside of Ukraine, inside the borders of Ukraine, significant numbers of them have no interest in serving in the military. They're basically draft dodgers. And when you're badly outnumbered in terms of the size of your population vis-a-vis the Russians, you sort of need every eligible male, or at least the vast majority of those eligible males, and maybe even females, to sign up and move to the front to fight against the Russians. But it's impossible to get everybody to fight. Lots of people are interested.
And look, John, it makes complete sense. Actually, both sides of this equation are logical and rational given what's been going on. On the Russian side, they see that their leader has a plan. They see they have the industrial capacity. They see that they're making methodical progress on the battlefield. They saw that all last year they prevented virtually any penetration of their defensive lines. So that was successful. Now they're going forward. So success breeds success. On the other side of the line, you see that Ukraine, for well over a year, kept promising this offensive was going to succeed. They were going to go to the Azov coast. They were going to push the Russians back to the 1991 borders. Victory is ours repeatedly by Zelensky. And then they saw none of that happen. Then they saw that now then there's discord among the senior leadership. Then they end up firing the commander in chief. Now then here comes this new one. And the first thing he does is lose another city. And there's more discord. They see that none of the promises they've made work. They can see with their own eyes the disparity between the ammunition and the weapons and how that's always going back. So why would you want to rush to go sign up to die when you see that you can't trust your leaders? They're not truthful with you, and that what they claim doesn't happen. Those things aren't static. They're continuing to go in opposite directions. And again, it gets back to, well, why don't we do what's rational and try to move this to a negotiated settlement?
Well, there's no daylight between you and me. I agree with everything you said. Who wants to be the last person to die in a war that you're going to lose anyway? I think that sort of mentality has taken over in good part on the Ukrainian side. And on the Russian side, I think a lot of people believe that a new Russia is being created here as they annex these various oblasts in Western Ukraine. And I think there are probably a good number of people who want to be part of this enterprise. They think that it's a noble enterprise. Putin certainly makes that argument at this juncture. So I think you have, different psychologies on both sides, which just adds to the problems that the Ukrainians face in terms of raw numbers. So they are, as you put it, basically doomed. And the end result is that everybody should be working at this point to figure out some sort of negotiated settlement, because that's certainly in the Ukrainians' interest.
Yeah, it's in the Ukraine's interest. It's also in American interest because, as you and I were chatting briefly before we came on air today, the U.S. has gotten out of lots of arms control agreements, things that are important going forward. This war is going to come to an end probably sooner than many think, but at some point it's going to end no matter what. All wars do. This one will as well. And Russia's still going to exist. We're still going to exist. So the question is, what kind of world do we want to go forward, and how do we want to prevent any of these from erupting in the future, and certainly from going nuclear if anything weird happens with that? And a couple of days ago, or very recently, Matt Miller from the State Department was asked, hey, is there any thoughts given to either trying to increase or continue on negotiating with Russia on some arms control agreements, or maybe starting new ones? And notice how dismissive he is of that possibility.
We are not going to boost our security or boost any security agreements or start any security agreements with the government of Russia, a government that we have seen invade one of its neighbors unprovoked, kill thousands and thousands of people for no reason at all except to pursue the personal conquest objectives of the Russian president. So no, we will not be taking that step.
So, yeah, don't like him. So, no, we're not going to do anything that could work in our favor in the future once these emotions have settled. What do you think when you hear comments like that?
Well, it just goes to show you just how intense the Russophobia is in the West and how intense the hatred of Putin is. We've reached the point where we're so blinded by our rage towards the Russians that we're unable to see straight. We're unable to recognize that this war is a lost cause, and that the best possible outcome for us at this point in time, and certainly the best possible outcome for the Ukrainians, is to get some sort of negotiated settlement. It just makes no sense to continue this war. But nevertheless, we're so deeply committed now to beating the Russians, to not letting them win. We're so enraged by what Putin has done that we are just unwilling to quit. We just want to double down at every turn.
But John, I mean, that is what's happening. It's evident, so we can see it. But I just can't get my head around how you can keep doing that, because it can't end well. Or is there still a fantasy going on among the policy elite in this country that thinks that, no, if I just say it enough, eventually it'll come to pass? I don't know. Do you have any insight into that mentality?
Well, you, on one hand, kick the can down the road, right? And you think that maybe some miracle will happen. But you don't want to quit. I mean, you saw this in Afghanistan. Remember, we were in Afghanistan for 20 years.
Fair point.
There were lots of people who didn't want to get out and are still criticizing us for getting out. And I remember, by the way, as I've said before, I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which was coterminous with the Vietnam War. You want to remember that Richard Nixon is elected in 1968, and he has an opportunity to get out. He takes office in January 1969. The only reason we really get out of Vietnam is because Congress forces our hand. There's just so much protest inside the United States. But President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, we'd still be there today fighting if they had had their way, because they didn't want to leave. You always want to remember that it's once the United States gets involved in a war, it's very difficult to get out. It is very difficult to get out. That's one of the reasons I am, generally speaking, opposed to getting into wars, because once you're into them, you can't get out. And this is a perfect case in point. And by the way, the same situation is true of the Israelis and the Americans in the Gaza war. Please tell me how we're going to get out of that one. Tell me how the Israelis are going to get out of that one. They're up to their eyeballs in alligators. And the same thing is true with us in Ukraine. And I just don't, see much hope.
Indeed, but it is, more alligators in the Middle East. In fact, that's a good transition point, because I don't want you to get away today before we talk about that, because especially diplomatically, there's been a lot of issues going on recently, and we had an exchange kind of between Blinken and Netanyahu. There's been a lot of focus from the White House on this Rafah operation. Now, I'd like to say that they finally have become aware of the sheer level of human suffering that's going on by the Palestinian population. So they're going to do the right thing morally. But I'm sure the more likely scenario is it has to do with electorally. They see a lot of their base starting to push against Biden, especially with the Michigan and Minnesota votes that happened a month or so ago in the primary. And so now then they're trying to look like they care a little bit more. So the White House sent Blinken to Netanyahu to talk to him personally and say, listen, don't go into Rafah, because it's going to cause these enormous casualties, and all kinds of bad things are going to happen from that. And so I think it was on the 21st of March, before that meeting, Blinken said this.
A major military operation in Rafah would be a mistake, something we don't support, and it's also not necessary to deal with Hamas, which is necessary.
So it is not we don't think it's a good idea. We do not support it, and we do support you because we give you all this stuff. We don't support that, and we think there are better ways to do it. 3 days later, Netanyahu gave his public response.
היום עם מזכיר המדינה בלינקן. אמרתי לו שאני מאוד מעריך את העובדה שיותר מ5 חודשים אנחנו עומדים יחד במלחמה נגד החמאס. אמרתי לו גם שאנחנו מכירים בצורך לפנות את האוכלוסייה האזרחית מאזורי המלחמה, וכמובן לדאוג גם לצרכים ההומניטריים. אנחנו פועלים לשם כך. אבל גם אמרתי שאין לנו דרך לנצח את החמאס בלי להיכנס לרפיח ולחסל את שארית הגדודים שם. ואמרתי לו שאני מקווה שנעשה את זה בתמיכה של ארצות הברית, אבל אם נצטרך, נעשה זאת לבד.
So basically, in your face, and we're going to do whatever the hell we want to do. And we want more of your bombs and missiles and airplane loads full of equipment and stuff that we need. Keep your opinions to yourself. We're going to do whatever. Then when we had the temerity to not obey Netanyahu and did not veto that resolution at the United Nations Security Council the other day that says looking for an immediate ceasefire, in anger, he said he was furious, according to many of the reports. So he canceled a visit by some people that he was going to send to Washington to try and coordinate some stuff with Rafah. So now he's like, not going to do that. He's going to continue to go forward. Doesn't care what this UNSC finding came, this non-binding, as Kirby later called it, resolution, meaning we're still giving you a green light. We're still not going to do anything. But John, how can it be that we can allow another government to basically tell us what we're going to do with our own stuff, and then we listen to them?
Well, Israel is pretty much free to do what it wants because it's protected here in the United States, mainly by the Israel lobby. It's almost impossible for any president to really rein in the Israelis when it comes to dealing with the Palestinians. We can slap them on the wrist, but not much more than that. The problem here is that Netanyahu is committed to defeating Hamas. And there are a handful, somewhere between 4 and 5 battalions of Hamas fighters in Rafah. And of course, he makes the argument, which you can understand from his point of view, that if he's going to defeat Hamas, he's got to go get those 4 or 5 battalions. And we're committed to having him defeat Hamas, but we don't want him to go into Rafah and get those 4 or 5 battalions of Hamas fighters that are located there. And he's saying that this doesn't make sense. And from his point of view, you can kind of understand it. But from our point of view, we understand this would be a humanitarian disaster, and we cannot allow that to happen. So we argue. My basic point on this is he's not going to defeat Hamas, whether he goes into Rafah or not. This is a fool's errand. And we all ought to acknowledge that at this point in time. I've been following very closely the progress of the IDF in Gaza, and the idea that they have finished off or they're close to finishing off Hamas is not a serious argument. Hamas is here to stay for the long term. And going into Rafah doesn't make any difference. But nevertheless, he thinks he meaning Netanyahu, thinks it makes a big difference. He's committed to doing it. And he doesn't want to be in a position where he looks like the Americans have forced him not to invade Rafah and not to complete the job, because he
and John, I'll just tell you from a military perspective. I mean, from my viewpoint, it's even worse of a problem than what you had just articulated. Even for what he's trying to do, because the massive number of civilians that have been killed, especially women and children, and the fact that the whole infrastructure of the entire strip has almost been destroyed, so that there's no prospect to have hope for a future there, even when the bombs finally fall silent, is that he is creating so much worse of a security risk for Israel that ever existed before 10/7. Even if every single Hamas person who was a Hamas fighter before 10/7 was actually killed in this process, the number of people who are being willing to pick up the arms and run in their place is like tenfold what it was before. So even if he got the battalions that he claims, that he is in no way, shape, or form eliminating the problem. And as Chaz Freeman said on our show last week, it's also issues outside of the gates here that he also has to worry about, that he's laying the siege for future attacks, possibly even externally.
Yeah, there's no question about that. I mean, if you look at the size of the IDF force in Gaza at the start of the invasion, there were about 60,000 troops. My guess is that they have probably about 15,000 troops at the moment. They've pulled out most of the troops. They just don't have enough troops to police Gaza. And it's important to emphasize, they are now having problems with Hamas in northern Gaza. Northern Gaza was supposed to be cleaned out of Hamas. It was supposed to be empty of Hamas fighters. But there are now Hamas fighters in the north, and the Israelis are back in the north fighting them. Furthermore, just to take this a step further, if you're Hamas and you are in Rafah and the Israelis come in and they come after you, why not just go down into the tunnels and escape from Rafah and move to another place in Gaza and live to fight another day? Are you going to sit there and let the Israelis finish off those 4 or 5 battalions? I wouldn't do that if I were Hamas. So once you start thinking about the game that Israel is playing against Hamas, it's impossible for me to see where the Israelis prevail or how they prevail. And then final point that I would make, which is one that you were making, is that there are no plans on the part of the Israelis for how to deal with Gaza once the shooting stops. I mean, what are we going to do here? We have huge numbers of people who have been displaced, huge numbers of people who are on the verge of starvation, huge number of people who are operating in an environment where there's no political system that they can turn to help regulate their daily lives. Who's going to fix this problem? What's the solution? There's no answer. So again, this one is just going to go on and on.
It's just anguishing to see, because it's not even, I mean, everybody's focused on the issue of whether Israel is going to go into an operation in Gaza and, spike the death toll again here, and understandably so. But it's so much bigger than just what happens in Rafah, because the entire region is going to continue to suffer, because the population already is now, according to Blinken last week, 100% of the population is now dependent on external aid. There is no economy. It doesn't exist, and there isn't for the foreseeable future. So probably my guess is this whole floating piers stuff that's coming in is not just because Netanyahu won't open the gates and just let these thousands of trucks in, which could solve that problem in an afternoon. We keep doing stuff like on the screen here with these new airdrops, which make great video, but are just a drop in the bucket here. But I think that is so that the international community continue to facilitate food indefinitely in the strip, so that Israel can just try to not worry about it, and maybe even just seal the thing off and, yeah, y'all figure it out. I don't know if that's for sure what they're doing, but it sure is suspicious.
The problem is that I think world opinion won't let them do that. I mean, the Israelis are suffering enormously in terms of international legitimacy, in terms of their reputation by what's happening. Something has to be done to deal with the problem that the Israelis have created in Gaza. And I don't know exactly what they're going to do, but they are in the middle of it. You want to remember, it's very important to remember this. that the Israelis got out of Gaza in 2005. They got completely out. In 2005, they pulled out the settlers that they had in Gaza, and they pulled out the troops that they had in Gaza, and they turned it into a giant open-air prison. And it was Ariel Sharon who pulled the troops and the settlers out. And the reason he did that was he understood that the Gaza Strip was a hornet's nest, and it made much more sense for the Israelis to be out of it rather than to be in it. Well, if you look at what's happened now, they're back in it. They're back in it in a big way. And they've created this mess with their monstrous policy in Gaza that does not have an easy solution. And they apparently, they meaning the Israelis, have not put forth any solution for dealing with this problem moving forward, which raises the question, where are we headed here?
Right.
And I see nothing but trouble ahead for the Israelis and for the Americans, and certainly for the Palestinians who are caught in this maelstrom.
Indeed. And the last question I have for you today is do you have any sense, because we've been, for understandable reasons, talking about the Gaza Strip and all that goes along with that, but there are also about 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, and there's been lots of issues there that have been kind of falling under the radar. Do you have any sense of how things are evolving and developing there, and how that might play into whatever happens in the Gaza Strip?
Well, I think terrible things are happening in the West Bank, but the things that are happening there are nowhere near as terrible as what's happening in Gaza. But it's quite clear that the settlers are on the march. They're taking territory away from the Palestinians in the West Bank. And in many cases, they're doing absolutely terrible things to the Palestinians. I think it's clear that the Israelis would like to ethnically cleanse Gaza and ethnically cleanse the West Bank. And if they have an opportunity to do that in either case, they will do it. I think they tried, but they so far have failed in Gaza. They've not really had much of an opportunity to cleanse the West Bank, but that opportunity may present itself down the road. But this is a disastrous situation, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. And I am sad to say I see no hope in either case.
Well, yeah, and I think that as long as Netanyahu's in power, as long as the current administration in the U.S. Remains where they are, I mean, I don't know why either one of them would do anything different than they have from the outset of this, and that's just anguishing to consider for the most powerless and the helpless of the people in the Gaza Strip with the Palestinian people. And my heart just bleeds for them in that case.
But I would just say, Danny, I don't think it matters whether you have Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, or anyone else in Israel driving that train. They are committed to creating a greater Israel, and they are committed to pushing the Palestinians out. A lot of people in the United States like to argue that Netanyahu's the problem. You saw this with Senator Schumer's famous speech, let's get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu, then we can fix all these problems. I don't believe that for 1 second. This problem is much bigger than Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, he actually went on Fox News, I want to say a week ago Monday, and was making this case before them. He said, y'all think that it's me? He says, no, this is what our people believe. They're all for it, and they're with me. And I think in that regard, he was probably right.
Yeah, and by the way, I'd say the same thing is true in the United States. If you had Hillary Clinton in the White House instead of Joe Biden, it wouldn't make any difference. And if you had Donald Trump in the White House instead of Joe Biden, it wouldn't make any difference either. And the principal reason is the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby means that any United States president, whether he or she is a Democrat or a Republican, has remarkably little maneuver room and hardly any ability.
I would argue that they could show some leadership and say, you can keep your money if you want to. I'm going to do what makes sense here. That's actually possible. I just don't see anyone with the courage or the guts to do it, but that would change the dynamic.
There's no question about that. But that politician would definitely suffer greatly and would not be around for long.
Yeah, well, I'm worried about whether he would stay around for long, is whether one would arise. That would have to be first, because as you pointed out, there's nobody on the political horizon that would fit that description. But we'll have to save that one for another day. But listen, John, thank you so much for coming on today. It's really enlightening, and always love having you on talking about these really complex issues. You can put them in language that regular people can understand, so at least we know what's really going on. Thank you again for coming on today.
My pleasure, Danny.
And we thank you guys for joining us today too. As always, we ask you to like and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Share this with your friends. If people want to know, what can be done or what's really going on, share this video with them so that they can see here's what the real truth is, despite what you may hear elsewhere. Definitely join us tomorrow at 1 o'clock. We're going to have the ever popular Doug McGregor going to give us some military updates. And he always has a way of showing things from the military side that you just don't get anywhere else. So tune in at 1 o'clock tomorrow, and we will remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth that you need for your world. And we will see you tomorrow on Deep Dive.